In the spring of 1956, a profound silence fell over one of the largest horological manufacturing empires in the world, when the New Haven Clock Company finally locked its massive factory gates in Connecticut. The shockwave did not merely empty an American industrial town. It rippled directly across the Atlantic, striking the high street jewelers, the cluttered repair benches, and the working-class sitting rooms of Britain. For nearly a century, this single company had flooded British ports with millions of stamped brass clocks. They were not the elite hand-finished fusee wall clocks or the aristocratic long case clocks of London makers. They were something far more disruptive, cheap, relentless, mass-produced time. By the time the firm collapsed into bankruptcy, it had manufactured tens of millions of timepieces. A New Haven clock sitting on a British mantelpiece had become as common as a teapot, providing a reliable, mechanical tick to families who could never have afforded a traditional English clockmaker. But in 1956, the system broke. The factory was sold, the heavy stamping machinery went quiet, and the endless transatlantic supply of affordable brass movements ceased forever. The consequences for the British clock trade were quiet but absolute. Repairers who had serviced these ubiquitous wooden-cased clocks for decades suddenly found them orphaned, their parts drawers unable to be restocked. The hardware stores and high street shops that once relied on these cheap imports were forced to confront a new reality of electric alternatives. A generation earlier, the name New Haven on a painted dial had meant a revolution in domestic timekeeping. The paradox is that the company did not disappear because Britain stopped needing time. It disappeared because the very system of mechanical mass production it helped invent had become obsolete, outpaced by the electric plug and crushing post-war debt. But the real story of the New Haven Clock Company is not just the story of a factory closing its doors. It is the story of how cheap mechanical time conquered the British home, and what happened when the world stopped needing it. Every week, we tell the stories of British clocks, watches, workshops, jewelers, and rooms that once taught the country how to live with time, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific absence in a British sitting room in the mid-19th century, where time was still too expensive to own. Before the 1850s, a clock in a British home was a statement of profound wealth. The English clockmaking tradition, centered in London and provincial towns, was built on exceptional craftsmanship. A long case clock, a tall floor-standing clock with a pendulum and weights inside a wooden case, represented months of skilled labor. An English bracket clock, a spring-driven clock designed for a table, shelf, or wall bracket, cost more than a working-class family might earn in a year. Time belonged to the church tower, the wealthy merchant's hallway, or the factory wall. For the average British household, domestic time was largely silent. This absence created a vacuum. Across the Atlantic, a radical shift in manufacturing was underway. In 1853, Hiram Camp, alongside his uncle Chauncey Jerome, incorporated the New Haven Clock Company in Connecticut. They did not aim to build better clocks than the British. They aimed to build them faster and cheaper than anyone thought possible. Their method relied on stamped brass parts. Instead of casting and individually hand-finishing heavy brass plates and gears, machines punched them out of sheet brass by the thousands. When these clocks began arriving in British ports, they decimated the traditional pricing structures. A local English clockmaker simply could not compete with the sheer volume and brutally low cost of the American imports. The New Haven movements were rougher, the wood was often cheaper, and the finishing lacked the polish of Clerkenwell artisans. But they kept time, and they could sit on a mantelpiece for a fraction of the cost. The invasion was swift. By the late 19th century, catalogs across Britain began listing these affordable timepieces. High street jewelers, initially resistant to selling what they considered inferior mass-produced goods, were eventually forced by market demand to stock them. The working-class sitting room finally had a heartbeat, powered by a coiled mainspring, a strip of metal that stores energy when wound with a key. That first success did not solve the problem. It created a global factory system that now had to be fed. The true breakthrough for New Haven in the British market was not merely a single clock, but the normalization of the disposable timekeeping aesthetic. The most famous of these imports became known as gingerbread clocks, ornate pressed wood mantel clocks that looked suitably impressive but were incredibly cheap to manufacture. Inside these wooden cases beat a highly standardized movement. The escapement, the mechanism that releases power one beat at a time and creates the tick, was designed for easy assembly rather than longevity. Yet, they were surprisingly durable. They ran for 8 days on a single winding, a feat that provided immense convenience for a busy household. The distribution network in Britain expanded rapidly. New Haven clocks were not just sold in traditional jewelers, they appeared in hardware stores, department store counters, and mail-order catalogs. The brand introduced a line of extremely cheap pocket watches, portable timekeepers designed to be carried in a pocket, often referred to as dollar watches. These flooded the British market, allowing laborers, railway porters, and schoolboys to carry time on their person for the very first time. In a British repair shop, the arrival of these clocks shifted the culture. A repairer was no longer just servicing handcrafted fusee wall clocks. They were now confronted with stamped plates that often required crude bushings, small repair inserts used to tighten worn pivot holes, just to keep them running. The clock on the mantelpiece was no longer an heirloom. It was a consumer good. The name on the dial was not a mark of elite craftsmanship. It was a promise that time was finally affordable. By the early 20th century, the New Haven Clock Company was operating on a scale that defied comprehension. They were producing over 40 million timepieces globally. In Britain, their footprint was immense. Walk into a terraced house in Yorkshire, a school corridor in Manchester, or a modest sitting room in London, and you were likely to hear the rapid, tinny tick of a New Haven escapement. Their product lines dominated the lower end of the catalogs. They provided the standard alarm clock, a clock designed to ring at a set time, for thousands of British workers, dictating when the factory shift began. The scale of their production meant they could absorb shipping costs and still undercut European competitors. In a British sitting room, where the mantel clock stood as the centerpiece of domestic life, the New Haven timepieces did not merely show the hour. They organized the family rhythm. They signaled the time for tea, the departure for work, and the end of the day. They were the mechanical companions to a rapidly industrializing society. This peak presence created a sprawling network of dependency. High street jewelers relied on the constant churn of cheap sales and minor repairs. The British market had fully integrated these American machines into its daily existence. The company expanded into wristwatches and experimented with early electric clocks, attempting to dominate every surface where a clock could be placed. The sheer volume of brass, wood, and glass crossing the Atlantic represented an unprecedented commodification of time. However, an empire built purely on volume is inherently fragile. The New Haven Clock Company was a massive machine that required constant, massive sales just to keep its factory doors open. The clock was still ticking reliably on the mantelpiece. But the market economics beneath it were already beginning to fracture. The decline of New Haven in the British market did not begin with a sudden collapse, but with a series of quiet shifts in retail and technology. The first small crack appeared in the catalogs. As the 1930s progressed, the dominance of the mechanical spring-driven clock was challenged by the synchronous electric clock. The electric clock did not need a winding key. It did not need a heavy brass movement. It drew its timekeeping frequency directly from the national electrical grid. For British consumers, the electric clock offered silent, perfect accuracy without the weekly ritual of winding. New Haven attempted to pivot, producing electric motors and new case designs, but they were now competing in a completely different technological arena against domestic giants like Smiths and international electrical conglomerates. Furthermore, the onset of the Second World War severely disrupted transatlantic trade. British high street jewelers, cut off from American imports, turned to domestic wartime production, or struggled to survive. After the war, the economic landscape had changed. Britain was recovering from massive debt, and the importation of cheap American clocks was no longer a priority. The repair benches across the country began to see fewer New Haven clocks coming in for service, as the cost of repairing a worn-out stamped brass movement often exceeded the cost of buying a modern electric replacement. Back in Connecticut, the financial strain on the New Haven Clock Company became unbearable. They had accumulated massive debts, struggled with changing consumer tastes, and failed to modernize their aging factory lines effectively. The very system that had brought them glory, the massive, inflexible infrastructure of mechanical mass production, now became their tomb. In Britain, the transition was merciless. The quartz movement, a battery-powered movement, regulated by a vibrating quartz crystal, eventually arrived, offering cheap disposable accuracy that rendered even electric clocks obsolete. The market forces were clear: Force 3, good enough time, and Force 5, culture shift, completely destroyed the need for the mass-produced mechanical mantle clock. The factory struggled through the early 1950s, restructuring and desperate for capital. But the era of cheap, repairable mechanical time was over. The catalogs dropped them. The jewelers cleared their shelves. The spare parts dried up. The final collapse was inevitable. The machine stopped. The factory gates locked. The brand vanished. The workers went home. The transatlantic shipments ceased. The repair benches moved on. But the objects themselves refused to die. Rooms, car boot sales, and antique shops. Their clocks are no longer the essential timekeepers of the working class. They are curiosities, remnants of a forgotten industrial age. Yet, they pass the ultimate test of historical value. They still work. Take a 120-year-old New Haven gingerbread clock to a competent British repairer, have the pivots polished and the bushings replaced, and it will faithfully resume its loud, rhythmic ticking. It proves that even the cheapest, most aggressively mass-produced mechanical objects of the Victorian and Edwardian eras possessed a fundamental repairability that modern, disposable electronics entirely lack. The legacy of New Haven in Britain is the memory of when time first became democratic. They forced the British clock trade to adapt to a world where a clock was no longer a luxury, but a basic household utility. The factory is gone, its physical site in Connecticut repurposed and partially destroyed by fire, but the millions of brass gears it punched out continue to slowly unwind on shelves across the world. Somewhere in a quiet British sitting room, an old wooden mantel clock still sits above a sealed fireplace, its painted dial faded, its brass key resting nearby, waiting for someone to give it back its voice. See you in the next one.